Hey everybody. This is a review of a book about Bruno Rizzi by Alessandro Orsini. It says Le eretico della sinistra, Bruno Rizzi elitista democratico. This review is by João Bernardo. I don't know anything about João Bernardo, but it does appear that he has pieces on libcom. I don't know necessarily what that entails. What that means about his politics. I'm going to see if there's a description of this book that just I can find. And I want to see who Alessandro Orsini is. It's important to find out who the people writing these books are. It'll probably say something in the book review if it's a decent book review, but it looks like Alessandro Orsini is an Italian sociologist and scholar of terrorism, who is an associate professor of the LUISS University. And the description for this book by him, called Le Electo della Sinistra, which translates as what? Let's see. Italian to English. The heretic of the left, Bruno Rizzi, democratic elitist. And let's see what this book's oh no, I didn't actually have to look up what this book title was called. I could have just translated the page I had the description put up on. It says, Bruno Rizzi, who lived from 1901 to 1977, was among the founders of the Communist Party of Italy. Expelled from the party for his ideas on the social nature of the USSR, he was one of the few Italian sociologists to have identified a real social law that does not suffer any exceptions. According to the, quote, Rizzi theorem, as Orsini proposes to call it, when the market dies out, civilization regresses in art, economics, architecture, poetry, politics, and every other manifestation of human progress sinks into the abyss of barbarism. Whether the market dies for unseen reasons, as happened following the spread of slavery in ancient civilization, or whether the market dies by a deliberate choice responding to a precise political plan, as in the USSR, the effects are always the same. The birth of a parasitic class of bureaucrats who assume, with the ownership of the means of production, control of individuals. The volume also uses numerous unpublished documents through which the author traces a decidedly unconventional profile of Rizzi. His figure is placed alongside that of the, quote, Machiavellians, Mosca, Pareto, Michel, documenting for the first time Rizzi's fundamental contribution to the theory of Italian democratic elitism. And it says, Alessandro Orsini, born 1975, is the author of Rethinking the Nation, published in 2002, The Origins of Nationalism, published in 2003, and teaches general sociology at the University of Tuschia, I don't know how to say that, Viterbo, and history of political doctrines at the Libera Università degli Studi Jean Monnet in Bari. Alessandro Orsini teaches and conducts research at the Chair of Advanced Sociology and Political Sociology at the Faculty of Sociology at the University of Rome, quote, La Sapienza. Alessandro Orsini collaborates with the Chair of General Sociology at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Rome, Roma Tre, and is a subject expert in general sociology at the Faculty of Political Science at Luis Guido Carli. So, that's what this book is about. And that's a little bit about Alessandro Orsini. But again, the article itself is by João, I can't remember how to pronounce his name already, Bernardo. But listen to what I said first, that was actually correct. Okay, so here we are. For many years, Bruno Rizzi, who lived from 1901 to 1977, was an obscure figure. The only book of Rizzi's that was talked about, La bureaucratisation du monde, or The Bureaucratization of the World, was published in France in 1939 and had a very restricted circulation. To my understanding, it was banned by the Popular Front government for its anti-Semitic content, which, if it was indeed there. It was known in some left-wing milieu only because Trotsky mentioned it cursorily and very critically in his essay of September 1939, The USSR and War, where Trotsky associated Rizzi with Hugo Urbans. Pierre Neville made an extensive and more balanced analysis of Rizzi's main thesis in his article La bureaucratie et la révolution, published in Arguments. 2 footnotes. This article is included in a posthumous anthology by Trotsky concerning Rizzi, also brief references to Rizzi in October 1939 essay, Again and Once More, again on the nature of the USSR, which is on this channel, and in the December 1939 essay, A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party, in Trotsky 1970. And it says Neville's article is reproduced in Fischler's edited volume, 1975. End footnote. But while, later, some of the collaborators of this French journal became deservedly well known, they were virtually unknown during the life of the publication from 1956 to 1962. Only the multi-shaded leftist movement that proliferated around the world during the second half of the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, and the renewed interest in a radical left criticism of the Soviet system, opened the way to mass editions of the first volume of the Bureaucratisation du Monde, as well as the works of several other authors, until then forgotten or discussed only inside a few groupuscles. Even now, Bruno Rizzi is known, when he is known at all, because of that one book. Alessandro Orsini's work usefully draws our attention to the evolution of Rizzi's thought, from the Trotskyist arguments expressed in 1937 in Dove va la URSS to his last letters. Sorry, I want to look at how what that translates as. Where is the USR going? One second. Okay, sorry. Regrettably, Orsini does not describe or did not uncover Rizzi's ideological trajectory before 1937, when he was expelled from the Italian Communist Party, and it would be interesting to know the origin of this passing fancy for Trotsky's theory, of Rizzi's passing fancy for Trotsky's theories. But, as La bureaucratisation du monde is not only a stage in a personal journey, it must also be judged in the context of left criticism of the Soviet Union's evolution. From this angle, Orsini's book is seriously wanting, and although it contains a summary of Trotsky's views pertaining to the Stalinist USSR, it does not situate them in the larger debate. Believing that socialism was identical with state ownership of the means of production, Trotsky maintained till the end that the Soviet Union remained a post-capitalist economy. He believed that the dearth of means of consumption, brought about by the USSR's economic isolation, engendered the emergence of a bureaucratic stratum to ration out goods and to distribute goods among the population. Trotsky never tired of repeating that, although this bureaucracy asserted its own privileges, the bureaucracy was not a social class, because the bureaucracy rested upon distribution, not relations of production. Thus, Trotsky inferred that, in spite of being parasitical, this social stratum was interested in maintaining the socialist relations of production, as it could not subsist without them. This paradox seriously limited the purchase of Trotskyist criticism of the This paradox seriously limited the purchase of the Trotskyist criticism of Stalinism. If Trotsky lost all his followers inside the Soviet Union, it was not only because of the political persecutions. These persecutions were effected because Trotsky's partisans were divided into two groups. On one side were those who believed that high-speed industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture strengthened the economic foundations of socialism. They offered their abilities to the administration of the 5-year plan and were annihilated later. I believe this was the case with Preobrazhensky. And more, if you look at the article by John Eric Merritt on this channel on the left opposition, as well as the pieces by Alexei Gusev, they would side with this position. Is that there's a degree to which in the post-Stalin historiography, I think in the Soviet Union and in the Stalinist historiography, there is a tendency to label Trotsky like the super industrializer. And people have tried to refute that and say that Trotsky was not partisan to the kind of ruthless, brutal, bloody campaign that Stalin unleashed on the peasantry and on the working class, and on the peasantry that became the working class as a mass increase in the proletariat size in the Soviet Union in the Stalin period. There's a little bit more. It's a little bit more complicated, and it's there's a degree to which that's true, but it's also true that when Stalin did switch course and broke the NEP and repressed the right opposition, which the Trotskyists always viewed as the worst danger. They were most concerned about people like Bukharin and their policies holding sway in the Stalinist center. Which they viewed the right opposition as totally reactionary and wanting to restore capitalism in the Soviet Union. But people like Preobrazhensky, I think critically in some capacity, although how critical he could be is a matter of debate. I believe at least capitulated to the Stalinist 5-year industrialization after being probably the theoretical heart of the left opposition. Whereas Trotsky was more of seemed to me at least, maybe take what I say with a grain of salt, but to be the politician of the left opposition in the USSR. The other thing that I'm thinking right now is that people that later capitulated, like Christian Rakovsky, who held out, I think, the longest of all of the Russian left opposition. On the one hand, there was immense pressure and probably threats of violence to do so. I think, in my opinion, he held out to maybe the mid-30s or whatever in terms of his opposition. I think he capitulated before the terror proper. Obviously, repression was going on before the terror proper. But I think he also had in mind that the USSR, he should stifle his criticism because the USSR was in imminent danger of facing a Western imperialist assault in the form of, I think, primarily Italian fascism and German Nazism. But anyway, back to the text. Sorry, I just got my mind going. Forgive me. You have to hear my marginalia. On one side, there were those who believed that high-speed industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture strengthened the economic foundations of socialism. They offered their abilities to the administration of the 5-year plan and were annihilated later. On the other side, there were those who rejected the idea that the Stalinist economy could be socialist, considering it an odd opinion to maintain when the 5-year plans made such an extensive use of Taylorism and Fordism, even more than in the United States. In the extreme left milieu opposed to Stalinism and critical of Trotskyism, some factions arose which began to examine the difference between the concept of juridical property relationships and the concept of social relations of production. State ownership of the means of production concerned property relations and should not be a criterion to define socialism, which should be defined as at the more fundamental level of the relations of production, considered as the organization of and control over the labor process. From this point of view, the Soviet Union was labeled by some extreme left factions as a, quote, state capitalism, and the conceptual panoply of Marxism was applied to define Stalinist bureaucracy as a capitalist social class. A regime of exploitation of the capitalist kind was said to exist in the Soviet Union. Another current of opinion also originated from left-wing opposition to Stalinism and criticism of Trotskyism, remained under the influence of the property relationships concept. If property pertained to the state, there would be no market. And without market, there would be no capitalism. If Stalinist society, that everyday experience showed to be the negation of socialist yearnings, was not capitalist, then it necessarily was something else. This was the occasion to define a post-capitalist mode of production and to define Soviet bureaucracy as a new kind of dominant class based upon a new mode of exploitation. From this point of view, the classification of the bureaucracy as a social class did not concern the level of the production process considered as a social relationship, but the level of property relationships. This context explains La bureaucratisation du monde, as it explains also other works from that period, some of them still forgotten, and more unfairly forgotten. To the reader interested in these matters, I recommend Henri Morel's excellent bibliographical review, which classifies and chronologically organizes the several currents of opinion critical of Soviet economy and society up to the end of the Second World War. Footnote. C. Morel, and I gotta go to the references. Henri Morel, Discussios. Okay, I see what it is. It's something in Italian, I believe, or maybe it's Portuguese. Anyway, granted that the author of this review is Portuguese, I can't really tell. It kind of looks like it could be something other than Italian, though. Where am I? End footnote. Notwithstanding the 30 years elapsed since it was written, it is an indispensable article. Inside Russia, the evolution to state capitalism and the emergence of a new bureaucratic exploiting class was developed already in 1918 among the anarchists and members of the Left Social Revolutionary Party, and even among the left wing of the Bolshevik Party. Afterwards, these polemics could only increase, and a book written by Anton Seeliger and published in France in 1938, thus 1 year before La bureaucratisation du monde, revealed that the criticism of the Stalinist regime as a mode of exploitation by the workers, mode of exploitation of the workers by a new dominant social group was taking place inside the Soviet political prisoners' camps. Seeliger's book made available copious information to those people who up till then were not conversant with the arguments among the Russian extreme left, or by ignorance of the languages had no awareness of the theoretical works produced by the German and Dutch communist ultra-left during the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, although some of these works were translated into French. Already in a book published in Paris in 1931, Lucien Leroy argued that Soviet bureaucracy had changed into a, quote, new exploiting class, end quote. Footnote. Footnote. A biography of Lucien Leroy can be found in Panay, 1988. End footnote. There's very little I can find on Lucien Leroy. I'd like to find more. Anyway, end footnote. The Trotskyist faction, quote, falls more and more behind with reality, end quote, charged Leroy. Quote, it does not see the oligarchic bureaucracy is already formed as a class, end quote. Leroy. (1931). Leroy acknowledged that the socialist branch of the Soviet economy seemingly retained capitalism's main features, but in his view the absence of private property and of market competition inside that branch was enough to prove that we were not dealing here with capitalism. The Soviet bureaucracy did not lead a state capitalism, maintained Leroy, and it also did not carry out a capitalist politics subordinated to the private owner's interests. Quote, what distinguishes Russian Revolution from the prior revolutions and prevents any comparisons, end quote, said Leroy, quote, is the emergence of a new leading caste and the formation of the economic foundations of this caste, while the very revolutionary process is going on since the seizing of power. I'm going to repeat that. What distinguishes the Russian Revolution from the prior revolutions and prevents any comparisons, said Leroy, is the emergence of a new leading caste and the formation of the economic foundations of this caste, while the very revolutionary process is going on since the seizing of power, end quote. Leroy. This is a very interesting book, not only because it antedates by 8 years La bureaucratisation du monde, but also because the quality of Leroy's economic reasoning and of his social analysis places his book at a much higher level than Rizzi's. After a minute study of the Soviet economy's internal obstructions, Leroy concluded with an alternative that today seems prophetic. Either the USSR will go back to capitalistic private property or will constitute a system of public control through the establishment of a proletarian democracy. That seems to be pretty similar to Trotsky's position. Trotsky viewed the USSR as potentially leading to counter-revolution, in which case the means of production would be privatized, or there would be a restoration of the Soviet Union back onto the socialist course that was the intention of its founding. Of course, I don't know what Leroy thinks, if he thought that reform was possible. In 1931, Trotsky certainly thought reform was possible. It was not until 1933 that he decided reform was no longer possible. But Trotsky eventually comes to think that in order for a proletarian democracy to exist in the Soviet Union, there must be a quote political revolution. I don't know what Laura thinks, and as I said already, it's very difficult to find anything on Laura. I've been struggling for a long time. If you know anything about Lucien Laura, send it my way. Anyway, however, Orsini does not mention Laura, nor Siliga, nor the other authors who also maintain that Soviet economic foundations were not socialist. What is even worse, Orsini does not recount that the very same polemic that Trotsky engaged against Rizzi was engaged also against Lucien Laura, against Hugo Urbans, against Boris Souvarine, against Simone Weil, against Ivan Crépieux, and against Ivan, and others. So let's see. I have on this channel, I don't have anything from Hugo Urbans. Again, finding anything on him is difficult to find. I have a chapter from Boris Souvarine's Stalin, which was translated into English by C.L.R. James in the late 1930s. I have a piece by Simone Weil. It's like about the prospects of revolution, and which has in it contains within it some analysis of the Soviet Union. I have a piece by Ivan Crépieux that Ernest Haberkern and Arthur Lippow put in their book, Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism. And I have Emmy Vaughn's, I'm not even sure what the book is called right now. It's eluding me. But I have his full pamphlet that was translated into English at the time. With these systematic omissions, Orsini helps to bolster up the myth of Rizzi's originality, in spite of several authors or political militants having previously sustained similar opinions. This is particularly flagrant when we see that Trotsky, in the polemic against Rizzi cited by Orsini, begins attacking Hugo Urbans and immediately afterwards passes to Rizzi. We ought not to single out particular authors when the object of Trotsky's fury and sarcasm was really a collective one. A collective object. To recall this is not even a question of historical justice. The main point is that we cannot understand the theses argued for in La bureaucratisation du monde if we do not recognize that the different ways of perceiving juridical property relations and of ascribing to them, or not ascribing, priority over the social relations of production account for the disagreements about the critique of Stalinism. The preponderance that the market topic acquired later in Rizzi's works was rooted in the preponderance already given in the 1939 book to the juridical concept of property relations. Rizzi's argument was strictly directed at the Soviet Communist Party's control over the central political apparatus, and Rizzi was not interested by the relations of production in the social context of business. Rizzi stressed state control, not control of the labor processes, and he presented the transformation taking place in the exploitation system as one taking place within the framework of the state. Quote, a failed attempt to manipulate the capitalist economy is enough to show that the political power shifts from the capitalist class to the state bureaucracy. End quote. Rizzi, 1939. This would change the economic rules of operation. Quote, state intervention in economic matters indicates that the nature of society and even of the state is beginning to change. When the process is completed, society will be different and will have a suitable state, ... As the state keeps expanding its economic intervention, the economy arrives at a point where it is no more capitalist, ... Society is changed, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. I don't know if I said this already, but I have the first part of Bruno Rizzi's bureaucratization of the world on the nature of the Soviet Union on this available on this channel because it was published in English in the 80s. in a book edited by Adam Westoby. I also have Westoby's introduction, which is full of good information. I also have a few pieces by Draper and Haberkern on Rizzi. So check those out if you're interested in hearing more straight from the horse's mouth what Rizzi had to say. I also have a translation coming up that I haven't put up on the channel, at least as of recording this. It might be up by the time I upload this, but it's a translation of the section of bureaucratization Dumas on the Jewish question, and it's a very disgusting anti-Semitic screed. So be on the lookout for that. In Rizzi's opinion, the economic system established by the bureaucratic class suppressed the market, and thence labor power was no longer under the effect of the law of supply and demand. If the bureaucracy exploited the workers in their entirety through the central political power and state trade unions, then bureaucratic collectivism substituted state slavery for proletarization. Quote, proletarians changed their juridical attire because they no longer sell their labor powers was formerly the usage in the capitalist free market, and they are in fact, quote, bought by the state, ... It is a new kind of collective slavery under the aegis of the state, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. However, considering these questions at a superficial level, Rizzi did not perceive that capitalism's centralized and statist organization never superseded the competition between production units nor annulled the mobility of labor power in the labor market. Orsini analyzes Rizzi's 1939 book and what it says about the workers' situation as if its only object was to criticize the USSR. Only further on, Orsini informs us that, quote, Rizzi extended to the whole world his reflections about the bureaucratization of Soviet society, end quote. But Orsini offers no further explanation of this. The truth is that Rizzi tried to expound a global vision taking in not only the Soviet regime, but also democracy and fascism. Although the book's section pertaining to the study of fascism was not published, we know that in Rizzi's opinion, Italian fascism and German National Socialism, quote, are in a process of quick bureaucratization and ... they already have an anti-capitalist character, although capital is not yet radically suppressed there, as it is in the USSR. Europe and the world must become fascist or socialist. Capitalism has no more prospect of life ... Bureaucratic collectivism ... rests socially upon the dominant classes which made the state their headquarters in Russia, in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, and in the smaller states ... This new social form is degenerate, but nevertheless it is active, and it supersedes more and more capitalism, which is dead as a propelling system, end quote. Rizzi, 1976. See also Rizzi, 1939. Although Orsini states that, according to Rizzi, with Soviet bureaucratic collectivism, quote, the manifestations of the state showed the same features characteristic of the totalitarian states of a fascist kind, end quote. We see that the convergence did not limit itself to the, quote, manifestations of the state, end quote, but occurred in the very economic system. And in Rizzi's opinion, the similarity did not stop with the totalitarian regimes. The New Deal, quote, indicates the initial stages of capitalism's economic dismemberment and of bureaucracy's political crystallization in America, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. As the outline of an analogous process was also discernible in France and in Great Britain, Rizzi inferred that all over the world, when capitalism had not been surpassed, it was on the verge of extinction. Quote, in its final evolution, the capitalist economy compels, after a fashion, the bourgeois state to betray its masters and to transform itself into a bureaucratic state, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. It is surprising that Orsini does not point out this central thesis of La Bureaucratisation du Monde. Orsini states that in his 1939 book, Rizzi reached a, quote, fundamental intuition, quote, according to which the USSR was a, quote, regressive society, end quote, when compared with capitalist society, end quote. That's not the impression I got when I was reading Rizzi, nor the impression that one gets from other things that read by Rizzi. Rizzi, there's quotes from Rizzi in which he says that the working class should support Stalinism um, and the and fascism, for that matter, in the sense that they were creating the conditions for socialism by establishing bureaucratic collectivism. So I don't really think he thinks that they're particularly regressive, but we'll see. But Rizzi maintains some very different opinions, supposing in the fashion of Marxist orthodoxy that productive forces develop gradually. Rizzi conceded that bureaucratic collectivism was a more progressive stage than capitalism. Quote, in a historical perspective, the task of this society is to raise in an orderly manner the world's total production, end quote, wrote Rizzi about bureaucratic collectivism, and Rizzi declared that, quote, next society will attain the highest limits of production concerning volume and perhaps also concerning quality, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. Moreover, in that book, Rizzi claimed that the combined strength of the proletariat and the collectivist bureaucracy would create the opportunity to proceed with a pacific reorganization of the world economy, which would lead to the democratization of bureaucratic collectivism, in a process heralding the arrival of the classless society. I think this is just from what I've read. Sorry for all the interjections, but I believe that Rizzi was of the view that part of the pacific reorganization of the world economy would be, in some sense, the Western capitalist countries tolerating, with the support of their proletariat, the expansion of fascism and fascism, National Socialism, and the Stalinist state. Basically, like the proletariat should support, whether or not they're German or Italian, they should support the imperial conquest and indeed the spread of Lebensraum. And that eventually Hitler and Mussolini would, in some sense, come to their senses about and become pacifists, in some sense. Anyway, during a long period of political and economic democratization, the state would progressively lose its oppressive character and would become a means of collaboration between the bureaucrats and the workers. Anyway, the bureaucracy was about to solve the two only problems preliminary to the formation of a classless society, as the bureaucracy substituted collective property for private property, and moreover it was directing production not by the profit principle, but by the principle of general benefit. I'm pretty sure within the, from what I know of bureaucratization of the world, Rizzi does say that the USSR pumps out surplus value, specifically surplus value, from the Soviet working class. So his use of just like categories specific that are general to any class society and categories that are specific to a capitalist society kind of like smushes them all together as if there was nothing specific about the concept of surplus value. Anyway, the bureaucracy was about to solve the two only problems preliminary to the formation of a class of society, as the bureaucracy substituted the collective property for private property, and moreover it was directing production not by the profit principle, but by the principle of general profit. Quote, the final ruling class of history is so near the classless society that the final ruling class of history, the bureaucracy, negates its class and proprietor nature, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. Therefore, communism would be bureaucratic collectivism's sole and ineluctable outcome. Quote, the totalitarian state will lose more and more the totalitarian state's political character to keep only its administrative character. This process will eventually lead to a class of society and to socialism, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. Again, nobody who only reads Orsini's book will be completely... anybody who only reads Orsini's book will be completely unaware of these theses professed by Rizzi in 1939. What is even worse, Orsini claims that Rizzi, quote, believed that planning could never lead to democracy. Its ultimate result would always be bureaucratic collectivism, which would necessarily impoverish millions of people, end quote. Orsini. Not only Orsini does forget some of the bureaucratisation du monde's crucial theses, but he misrepresents Rizzi's thought. In Il socialismo dalla religione alla scienza, which I guess is what? Italian to English. Socialism from Religion to Science, written between 1939 and 1943, Rizzi still attributed a positive role to the technocrats. Orsini quotes passages where Rizzi asserted that it will never be possible to abolish the political power of the minority against the majority, because it is indispensable to social order. And staying with this question, Orsini cites a passage from La bureaucratisation du monde, where Rizzi stated that the production process is necessarily directed by technocrats. But all this does not prevent Orsini from claiming that Rizzi attributed a parasitic role to the bureaucracy. The contradiction is even more gross when Orsini describes what he supposes to be Rizzi's, quote, original contribution, quote, to democratic elitism theory, end quote. The distinction between the, quote, necessary conditions, end quote, of socialism, which were, quote, the development of the productive forces, end quote, and the, quote, sufficient conditions, end quote, which were, quote, the existence of a political elite fit for leading the rising social class interests towards better relations of production, end quote. Orsini. It is amazing that Orsini does not know that this distinction was first thought of, or at least was first developed theoretically, by Lenin. Besides, Orsini misconstrues the specific concept of elite as it was formulated by Pareto and by Mosca, confusing it with the generic notion of active minorities, and he supposes that the concept of an elite was synonymous with the notion of revolutionary vanguard, common in the extreme left milieu. However, these concepts are originally distinct, and the concept of an elite is not opposed to the notion of vanguard, but to the concept of social class. The transformation of a revolutionary vanguard into an elite comprehended as a dominant social class marks the mutation of a revolutionary process into a counter-revolutionary process. Without being in the least troubled by his demonstration that, in Rizzi's opinion, experts were indispensable, state power was inevitable, and revolutionary elites were necessary, Orsini, apparently referring to Socialismo Infantile, a work published in 1969 to 1970, says that, from Rizzi's perspective, the development of market socialism would lead to the disappearance of the state. Also in a letter from 1970, Rizzi evoked the abolition of the state following the proliferation of market socialist firms. Still more paradoxically, as Rizzi embraced Robert Michel's thesis concerning the inescapably oligarchic tendencies of the parties and trade unions and began criticizing the political elites, we wonder whether the technocrats are indispensable to economic activities and the bureaucrats are not indispensable to political activities. We wonder whether the technocrats are indispensable to economic activities and the bureaucrats are not indispensable to political activities, or vice versa. Such contradictions, depriving Rizzi's work of any coherence, are unnoticed by Orsini. Even worse, after dedicating several pages of his book to showing, with plenty of quotations, that at least from 1950 onwards, Rizzi considered that political parties with permanent positions could not lead to socialism, Orsini concludes that Rizzi, quote, had a highly elitist conception of history, and in his view the political elites performed an indispensable leading role in the social changes. Without a political elite equal to the task, there will be no socialism, end quote. Orsini relegates to a footnote the topic of the antisemitism in La Bureaucratisation du Monde, which induced the French authorities to forbid the book, and he quotes, quote, "After all, National Socialism's and Fascism's racist struggle is only an anti-capitalist struggle led by the new social synthesis in a theoretically misguided way, but practically just. As always, the blind actions of the new ruling class is more effective than the truly conscious action of the social antithesis. Hitler is right, and we are wrong. We must correct our course and become anti-Semitic because we are anti-capitalist," end quote. Rizzi, however, the question is larger and much deeper. It is larger because it was not in a few sentences, but throughout some 10 pages, that Rizzi recommended to the working class a whole anti-Semitic program. Footnote. See Rizzi, 1939. It contained, besides the passage already quoted, assertions such as, quote, "The struggle against capitalism is necessarily identified, even if only in an incomplete way, with the struggle against the Jewish people," end quote. Rizzi also wrote, quote, "The Nazi and fascist movements, which although without being Marxist, are nevertheless, since a long time, and by their own nature anti-capitalist, show their anti-capitalism in an unconscious way through their struggle against Israel. We Marxists can have a clearer vision, including the anti-Semitism within the anti-capitalism. Once again, this proves that proletarians and dictators are historically placed together in the struggle against capital," end quote. Rizzi. But Orsini overlooks those cogitations. Besides being more extensive, the issue is much deeper because it concerns what Rizzi called a, quote, "new social synthesis," end quote. Orsini claims that for Rizzi, the bureaucracy's interests, quote, "are always opposed to those of the workers," end quote. But this is not true. While in capitalism, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat confronted I think this might be a typo here, but I'll just read what it says. While in capitalism, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat confront one the other as thesis and antithesis, in Rizzi's analysis, the bureaucracy was the historical synthesis of that confrontation. I think what it meant to say is, while in capitalism, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat confronted one another as thesis and antithesis, in Rizzi's analysis, the bureaucracy was the historical synthesis of that confrontation. Quote, "When the new class already emerged from the antithesis proletariat-bourgeoisie, the proletariat must withdraw from the class struggle because the cycle is accomplished. Thesis, antithesis equals synthesis. Proletariat, bourgeoisie, bureaucracy," end quote. Rizzi, 1939. The proletariat should not only renounce its claim to lead history, but should also discard the proletariat's alliance with the capitalist democracies and support the bureaucratic collectivist dictatorships, especially fascism. Quote, fascists made the theoretical mistake of aiming at a collaboration with the bourgeoisie, when on the contrary, they shall annihilate the bourgeoisie. In any way, they already left it half dead, end quote, wrote Rizzi. Quote, the collaboration should be with the proletariat, which nowadays is no more the proletariat, but the class of working citizens, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. It was in this context that Rizzi proclaimed, quote, Mussolini and Hitler lend Lenin a helping hand. Proletarians of France, England, and America lend Hitler and Mussolini a hand, end quote. Rizzi. Orsini claims that, quote, on the basis of his studies, Rizzi managed to foresee the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, end quote. In fact, Alessandro Orsini should have written that Rizzi called for the accomplishment of that pact. The antisemitism expressed by Rizzi in his 1939 book, which does a great deal by itself, originates in the plea for the historical abdication of the proletariat before the bureaucracy. But Orsini does not quote any of these passages, and Orsini does not even allude to them. Orsini could not examine that question without explaining why he qualifies Rizzi's attitude from 1939 until the end of the war as anti-fascist. Italian political police's uneasiness about Rizzi is not enough to define Rizzi ideologically. I wonder why Orsini relegates to a footnote the information that, during the Social Republic, Rizzi sent Mussolini a letter asking for his authorization to, quote, start an anti-communist and anti-monarchical newspaper, end quote, and comments only that the Reichspolice seized the letter. However, bearing in mind the passages from La bureaucratisation du monde referred to above, we see that Rizzi was himself doing what he advised to the, quote, proletarians of France, England, and America, end quote, lending, quote, Hitler and Mussolini a hand, end quote. Knowing what we know today, it is easy to criticize the practical consequences of the strategy expounded by Rizzi in La bureaucratisation du monde, although Orsini's book is silent about this matter. But, even as a theoretical work, La bureaucratisation du monde is inadequate and ought not to be considered an explanatory model. On the one hand, Rizzi conceived the bureaucracy as, quote, a new class, that in the USSR was a social fact already concluded, in spite of being still in development in the totalitarian states, end quote, Rizzi. In the last chapter of his criticism of the Soviet regime, Rizzi wrote, quote, this is a general, not only Russian phenomenon. In the USSR, this phenomenon is mainly bureaucratic, because it originated in the bureaucracy, but in the totalitarian countries it evolves naturally among the technicians, the experts, the trade union, and political officers, ... Its raw material comes from the copious state and parastate bureaucracy, from the company administrators, from the army, from the professions, and even from the workers' aristocracy, end quote. Rizzi. Rizzi mentioned the existence in the fascist regimes of, quote, a new ruling class in development, end quote. And even in North American democracy, quote, the prestige and the volume of the government's bureaucracy increases, end quote. State intervention in the economy, engendered by the New Deal, had a double social consequence. Quote, the bureaucratic class is in a process of development, whereas the bourgeois class is disintegrating, end quote. Rizzi, 1939. On the other hand, however, it was only in the Soviet case that Rizzi analyzed the historical process of development of the post-capitalist bureaucracy, and Rizzi ascribed to this social class a particular origin, ensuing exclusively from the path taken by the Bolshevik Revolution. Orsini extols Rizzi because in 1939 he considered that, in the USSR, the revolutionary vanguard first seized power and only afterwards established new relations of production. According to Orsini, in this way, Rizzi inverted the traditional relation between superstructure and base. But this does not prevent Orsini from writing in another chapter that only, quote, in the last years of his life, end quote, Rizzi, quote, admitted that in its action, the political elites could obtain an absolute preeminence above the economy, end quote, and, quote, could invert the base superstructure relation, end quote. Orsini's book is no less inconsistent than Rizzi's work, and as he does not emphasize that, in Rizzi's opinion, the bureaucracy was achieving hegemony all over the world, in countries where the revolutionary vanguard had not seized power, Orsini praises as a great discovery what was, in fact, the most flagrant weakness of Rizzi's reasoning. We ought to say the same thing about the parallel drawn by Rizzi between the Stalinist regime and the feudal system, which Orsini considers a strong point in Rizzi's work. This analogy between a regime distinguished by the weakness of the central state and the proliferation of secondary power centers, and another distinguished by the strength of the central state, is truly astonishing. But Rizzi fancied that in both feudalism and the Soviet regime, there did not exist a market for goods and labor power, and this was enough for Rizzi to proceed with a historical comparison, displaying once again the superficiality of Rizzi's views. On the other hand, if the Soviet Union had already acquired feudal features, then the Soviet Union's convergence with fascism and with the New Deal would suggest that we look for evidence of feudalism in the Roosevelt administration. Rizzi did not succeed in giving a general explanation for a general phenomenon, and we must remember this very serious limitation when we ponder this bid to represent Rizzi as the first author of a theory of the managerial class. Orsini claims this title for Rizzi, arguing that, quote, Rizzi was the originator of the, quote, new class concept, end quote. In particular, Orsini opposes him to James Burnham, against whom Rizzi debated, and whom he charged with plagiarism. When did Rizzi debate James Burnham? Like, is this like an actual exchange, or is it just like Rizzi moaning about Burnham, or Burnham claiming no relation to Rizzi? I don't know. In the chapters pertaining to this, Orsini raises the opinions of several authors, some of them inclined to believe that Burnham copied Rizzi's main ideas, others backing up Burnham's originality. However, Orsini writes that, quote, indeed the question remains controversial, end quote. And Orsini concludes that, despite the lack of any evidence of plagiarism, the suspicion is reasonable. But the main point is that Burnham was only one of the last of a lengthy progeny of left-wing critics who, from 1918, considered the Soviet Union a regime of exploitation. In the theories of the managerial class, the real significance lies with those authors who propose a process of development for this social class with a broad global scope. Primacy should be given here to Jan Václav Mahaisky, one of the main authors overlooked by Orsini, and who published his first consequential work in 1898 to 1899. In Siberian Internal Exile. Mahaisky argued that the intelligentsia, among whom Mahaisky included administrators and technocrats, though not owning means of production, was capitalist and exploited manual workers' surplus value through the monopolization of learning. Thence he deduced a dialectics essential to understanding 20th century social struggles. The intelligentsia was antagonistic to the proletariat, but at the same time took full advantage of the proletarian struggles to attack the bourgeoisie for the purpose of changing the profit allocation. Socialist propaganda, wrote Mahaisky, was used to, quote, conceal from the proletariat the specific interests of the intellectual workers, ... end quote. And the ideal society proclaimed by the Second International benefited the intelligentsia exclusively. Mahaisky predicted that the aim of this kind of socialism was to put the struggle of the proletariat at the intelligentsia's service and to help the intelligentsia seize state power. After defining political life, democratization as the, quote, penetration, bracket, of the intelligentsia, end bracket, into every pore of the bourgeois state, end quote, Mahaisky concluded that, in democracy, quote, the conveyance of all means of production to the intelligentsia, who already control the social government, would be for them a true paradise. In democracy, the socialization of the means of production will be for the workers nothing else than the strengthening of the power organization that dominates them and the reinforcement of the state, end quote. Mahaisky. In a text published in Russia in mid-1918, Mahaisky was thus in a position to expose as a myth the thesis that the seizure of power by the Bolshevik Party would involve the seizing of power by the working class. Mahaisky was the first to think through in a coherent and systematic way the distinction between juridical property relationships and social relations of production, and to consider the consequences of this distinction from an anti-capitalist angle. But as it leaves aside the history of the theory of the managerial class, Orsini's book gives an overstated importance to Rizzi, a latent inconsistent theorist. Orsini stresses the importance of the market as a topic in Rizzi's work after 1939, but to understand this ideological evolution, we need to remember that the juridical concept of property relationships was already in the foreground in La bureaucratisation du monde. In Rizzi's view, the historical drama alternated state property with private property, each accompanied by its corollary, central planning or market competition, and Rizzi did not care very much about the management of production and the social relationships established in the labor process. It is really surprising that Rizzi assigned to the market the role of a universal panacea, without being aware of the very deep changes undergone by the capitalist market over 2 centuries, and without taking into account the effect of oligopolies and financial institutions on market competition. What Orsini strangely called, quote, Rizzi's theorem, end quote, the opinion that the extinction of the market would lead to the collapse of civilization and culture, is a trivial freedom eulogy of a strictly moral content, although employing words with economic connotation. The essentially selfish character that Rizzi imputed to human beings, grounds Rizzi's notion of the market and of freedom. This moralistic approach caused Rizzi to draw near to the anarchist, even if other traits kept him inevitably apart from that political faction. As far as it is possible to disentangle Rizzi's ideas, which are at the same time naive and indistinct, the means to market socialism ought to be introduced to the sphere of buying and selling and of competition. This kind of theory necessarily confers on the market a neutral character, surmising that the rules of competition do not benefit only one of the sides. This is not the place to criticize those notions, but in Rizzi's case, the contradiction is too glaring. When Rizzi stated in Il socialismo dalla religione alla scienza, a book written in 1939 to 1943, that, quote, the market is the foundation and regulator of every social activity. The market is the foundation and regulator of every social activity, end quote. Rizzi bestowed upon the market the function of determining social relationships. And at the same time, Rizzi admitted that a new kind of social relationship could develop on the basis of that very same market. Rizzi's contradictions do not stop here. In a 1949 text, Rizzi maintained that, quote, socialism will still be a society grounded on the market, parenthesis, except the labor commodity, end parenthesis, end quote. Rizzi. And also in Socialismo Infantile, published in 1969 to 70, Rizzi asserted that in Rizzi's market socialism, labor would no longer be a commodity. However, in the bureaucratisation du monde, it had been enough to assume that labor power had lost labor power's commodity character for Rizzi to declare the existence of a state collectivism founded on collective slavery. Ten years later, Rizzi forgot to explain how it would be possible to maintain free competition in the market if the main factor of production was excluded from the market. This kind of contradiction, to which Orsini pays no attention, deprives Rizzi's works of any theoretical seriousness, and it is difficult to keep one's countenance and to admit that his meditations are not a joke when we see Rizzi in a long letter from 1970 striving to accomplish the first practical experiment of a market socialist firm with a body of municipal police. Even without taking these shortcomings into account, it is peculiar that Orsini gives such preeminence to what he calls, quote, Rizzi's theorem. In La Rovina Antica dell'Età Feudale, a work written in 1939 to 1943, Rizzi affirmed that ancient Rome experienced an underconsumption crisis brought about by the expansion of slavery, leading to the decline of the market, the proliferation of a state bureaucracy, and the collapse of civilization. In the same way, through its offensive against the market, modern totalitarianism would lead to a civilizational crisis. Orsini thinks that Rizzi, quote, established a true sociological law according to which in a given social formation, the level of oppression and of men by men's exploitation is in an inversely proportional relationship to the development of trade transactions, end quote. And he adds that, in Rizzi's opinion, quote, the market is the prerequisite for democracy and freedom, a true independent variable of human progress, end quote. However, bourgeois thought has continuously reiterated this thesis, which was already banal long before Rizzi's La Rovina Antica e l'Età Feudale. And what does this translate as? The ancient ruin and the feudal age. And even in spite pointing out that, with this book, quote, Rizzi recaptured a central feature of the liberal tradition, end quote, Orsini insists in awarding Rizzi a pioneer role. But if we must ascribe this, quote, theorem to somebody, the preference should undoubtedly be for the old physiocrats. The physiocrats explain that, as God established harmony among the elements of nature, God established harmony also among the elements of society, provided that society conform to natural order. Therefore, as market competition manifested God's purpose, every contradiction between human beings and society would vanish, and freedom would be inaugurated. But we do not need to go back to the 18th century to trace Rizzi's descent. The notion of market competition broadened its reach when Darwin used it as an inspiration, or a model, or an analogy for biological selection in the demarcation of species. Quote, the survival of the fittest was a commonplace in eugenics, as survival of the fittest was commonplace in economics, and survival of the fittest exculpated the massacres accompanying capitalist imperialism. This notion was also often identified with the Marxist notion of class struggle. George Sorel and his revolutionary syndicalist followers, for instance, viewed market competition from the Darwinian standpoint of the selection of the fittest, and therefore they objected to any kind of state intervention that would suppress or even mitigate competition. Free competition was, in their opinion, an indispensable condition of social struggle and opened the way to socialism. Anything hindering that struggle would devitalize the social classes and consequently would endanger civilization. Before the First World War, this thesis obtained a few favorable receptions in the Italian extreme left, chiefly in the milieus where Marxist influence consorted with interest in anarchism. And as revolutionary syndicalists were, altogether with the Arditi and the Futurists, one of the three original components of the fascist movement, notions about a relation between market, social virility, and culture permeated the whole political spectrum. Footnote: the Arditi were a kind of voluntary commandos during the First World War. End footnote. Moreover, they had a notorious influence upon Mussolini. The theme of degeneration of civilization, or even a racial degeneration, so important in conservative thought, was thus intertwined with the panegyric to the market. What Orsini called, quote, Rizzi's theorem, ought to be examined in that context. A passage from Il Socialismo dalle Religione alla Scienza, where Rizzi states that human beings are differentiated from animals because human beings need faith and beliefs, seemed directly inspired by the Sorelian theory of myths. Moreover, Rizzi, as Orsini states, quote, had a true admiration, end quote, for Robert Michel, I don't know how to say that guy's name, and Orsini considered that Michels had a very deep influence upon Rizzi. Now, Michels, who had been very close to the revolutionary syndicalists and who accompanied them when they converged with Enrico Corradini's radical nationalist, was pleased with Mussolini's rise to power. In 1928, Michels joined the National Fascist Party, and the next year he was a professor of the political science fascist faculty founded at Perugia. But Orsini remembers neither Robert Michel's connection with revolutionary syndicalism nor his connection with fascism, and thus Orsini misses the opportunity to show that the development of Rizzi's thought extended the intersection of a certain extreme left and the radical and nationalist right. Rizzi's endeavor from 1939 onwards to join socialism to the market was in no way original. When the French fascist Pierre Drew La Rochelle wrote in February 1945, a short while before his suicide, that, quote, liberal socialism, quote, is the original meaning of every fascist statism, end quote. He was articulating the market socialism which had been the farthest horizon reached by the right-wing populists. 25 years later, in Socialismo Infantile, Rizzi deemed necessary, quote, the alliance between liberalism and socialism to save the market and civilization as a whole, end quote. And Rizzi comments that Rizzi's thesis, quote, resumed a crucial theme permeating the whole of liberal thought: the citizens' guarantees against the abuse of power, end quote. But the short quotation from Drew La Rochelle, for those who have no time to read some exhaustive books about this subject, points out that, quote, the alliance between liberalism and socialism, end quote, had also been a theme permeating all of fascist thought. Economic statism in the fascist regimes was more or less prominent from country to country, and even within each regime it changed according to the occasion. But never has fascism discarded the market, and never did it give up the project of joining statism to liberalism. It's a highly dubious. Well, it seems really, really dubious to me. Unless you're just restricting liberalism to bourgeois property, right? Anyway, the silence that surrounded Rizzi's work, the quote conspiracy of silence, end quote, for Orsini, was not due to hard luck or to ill will. In 1939, Rizzi considered bureaucratic collectivism a beneficial stage in the liberation of humanity, and Rizzi did his best to bring together communist and fascist, even accepting antisemitism as a modality of anti-capitalism. And in 1939, he tried to participate in the double campaign of Mussolini's social republic against communism and against the monarchy. After the war, Rizzi was obviously a nuisance for one side and for what remained of the other, and if possible, he was still more troublesome for the Democrats, to whom Rizzi's work recalled that the close connection between fascism and liberalism had never been discontinued. Oversimplifying the criticism of planning and the eulogy of the free market, Rizzi was indistinguishable from any banal liberal or neoliberal post-war publicist, chiefly because he systematically confused all kinds of planning with one single type, Soviet planning. Rizzi's uniqueness in Italian politics after the Second World War consisted in calling socialism what really was an extreme liberalism, as he identified the public sector with the Soviet state economy. Rizzi went so far as to write to the Industrial Confederation chairman, proposing common action against state economic intervention, measures announced by the center-left government. But not even here Rizzi was original, because already before the First World War, the revolutionary syndicalists praised the employer's entrepreneurial spirit, reckoning it as the best stimulus to the class struggle. Rizzi merely removed from this attitude its connotation of violence and enunciated it in terms of social peace. Orsini can state that, quote, Rizzi's theses were an absolute exception, end quote, in post-war social democracy only because Orsini reenacts the trick he also used to display la bureaucratisation du monde as a work without predecessors and to extol, quote, Rizzi's theorem, end quote. Not to mention all the other authors that in several countries earlier, sometimes much earlier, had been saying the same thing and saying it better. Here Rizzi was less pretentious, and in the 1963 letter to the Industrial Confederation chairman, he commented on his own opinions, saying that, quote, it is not a solitary instance, end quote, and adding that, quote, in France, in England, in America, etc., and in embryo also in Italy, a socialist movement is forming, which is even more opposed than liberalism to the economic intervention of the state, end quote. Rizzi. This book by Alessandro Orsini endeavors to show us a Bruno Rizzi palatable to contemporary taste, expurgating everything of which neoliberals are not fond. Not only does Orsini fail to demonstrate that Rizzi was a great political thinker, still less an original thinker. Orsini also misrepresents the ideas stated by Rizzi in his most expressive work, La bureaucratisation du monde, and he does not help to elucidate the historical environment in which these ideas emerged, nor the path they took. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.